Hey there, if you're ready, let's begin. Have you ever heard of dog-headed men? Not quite what your history teacher talked about, is it? These weren't just characters in some fantastical story, they were documented, drawn, and discussed by serious medieval scholars. Tonight, we're going to explore a world where the impossible wasn't just possible, it was mapped, catalogued, and sometimes even venerated. As you listen, I invite you to make yourself comfortable. Perhaps dim the lights a little if you haven't already. Allow your breathing to slow down. Finding a gentle rhythm that feels natural. Let the sounds of the day, the notifications, the conversations, the endless noise of modern life begin to fade away. We're about to journey back through time to an age where candlelight flickered against stone walls, where the boundaries between the known and unknown were fluid, and where sometimes, just sometimes, the most extraordinary beliefs found their way into the most ordinary minds. This isn't a tale meant to excite or disturb, rather, it's a gentle exploration of how our ancestors understood their world, how they mapped the edges of their knowledge and populated those edges with creatures both fearsome and fascinating. Only like this if it helps you sleep or makes you wonder. Tonight we'll wander through medieval manuscripts, monasteries, and the misty boundaries between fact and folklore. And perhaps as your consciousness begins to drift, you might find yourself asking what mythical creatures populate the margins of our modern maps. What wonders do we still place just beyond the reach of our understanding? So settle in, let your eyes grow heavy if they wish, and join me as we step back in time to an age of monks, maps, and monsters. Close your eyes now and let the present gently slip away, replaced by the soft murmurings of another time. Feel the electric hum of modernity slowly dissolve, giving way to the comforting crackle of candle flames, the soft hiss of oil lamps, and the rhythmic dripping of wax onto worn stone floors. Smooth glass and steel fade, transforming into walls of rough-hewn stone, cool beneath your fingertips, marked by the countless touches of hands long gone. This is not the simplified medieval world of tales and legends, but a vibrant reality, rich, intricate, and deeply contemplative. Breathe deeply now and notice how the very air around you has changed. It is thick and fragrant, carrying the unmistakable aromas of beeswax candles, dry ink, and parchment aging gracefully on monastery shelves. The scent mingles with the faint tang of incense, drifting from distant altars where quiet rituals unfold behind heavy doors. Listen carefully, sounds of this era rise around you, softly enveloping you in their steady, comforting rhythms. The scratch of quill pens across vellum whispers quietly, mixing with murmured Latin prayers and the solemn chanting of monks, marking each hour, each moment as sacred. Time itself here is a gentle river, flowing slowly yet deliberately. It does not hurry nor rush, it measures its passage not in digital seconds, but in the graceful progression of shadows across sundials, in the resonant tolling of church bells echoing through village squares and monastic cloisters alike. Each ringing note gently divides the day into moments of work and prayer, contemplation and rest. A dance of earthly time synchronized to heavenly order. Now visualize a monk seated at his worn oak writing desk, his face softly illuminated by a thin beam of colored light filtering through the narrow slit of a stained glass window high above. His fingers, deeply stained with black iron gall ink and brilliant powdered pigments, delicately trace lines onto the parchment before him. With meticulous care, he draws a figure in the margin, captivating, peculiar, and impossible to ignore. This being possesses the body of a human yet is crowned by the alert, watchful head of a dog, its sharp muzzle and intelligent eyes crafted with thoughtful precision. This monk, clothed in his heavy woolen habit, is not crafting fanciful imagery born merely of imagination or whimsy. Rather, He meticulously records what respected scholars and seasoned travelers have described creatures believed to inhabit distant, mysterious lands. For him, these dog-headed beings were not myths casually dismissed but compelling realities, documented with reverence and serious intent. In our modern world, clear lines are drawn between fact and fantasy, science and symbolism. Yet for medieval thinkers, such boundaries were delightfully porous, wonderfully indistinct. Legends and daily realities were interwoven threads in the fabric of understanding, each lending meaning and context to the other. Geography was smaller, confined to what maps and travelers had explored. Yet the realm of possibility was infinitely expansive. Wonders did not diminish reality, they enriched it, providing profound insights into the spiritual dimensions of existence. As you journey deeper into this medieval consciousness, allow yourself to experience their emotional world, profoundly different from our own yet deeply relatable. The medieval heart knew fear intimately, fear of divine judgment, of hidden dangers lurking beyond village boundaries, of untamed forests pressing close at night. Yet alongside this fear thrived an equally profound sense of wonder, a fearless openness to mystery, enchantment, and divine providence. The universe for these medieval souls pulsed with meaning, every creature and event potentially imbued with symbolic significance, embraced too their comfort with paradox. Medieval minds could effortlessly hold seemingly contradictory truths together. A creature could be simultaneously monstrous and holy, a frightening omen, yet also a testament to divine creativity. The unknown was never merely empty or threatening, it was rich, filled with marvels and possibilities, a vibrant space where boundaries of humanity and divinity blurred seamlessly. Feel the gentle rhythm of medieval life, slower yet more intimately attuned to the natural world, its seasons, its rhythms, its sacred rituals. Allow yourself to fully inhabit this space, shedding modern skepticism and embracing the wonder of a world where the boundaries between natural and supernatural were wonderfully permeable. From this perspective, dog-headed beings were not fantasies but fascinating realities, worthy of scholarly contemplation, spiritual reflection, and sometimes wary vigilance. As this immersive vision gently wraps around you, imagine yourself fully present in this candlelit medieval world. Sense the cool stones beneath your feet, hear the rustling of parchment, and inhale the incense-laden air drifting through a cathedral's soaring arches. Prepare your mind and heart to explore a medieval cosmology rich and expansive, where beings like the Sinus Folas found their rightful place in the mysterious, magnificent dance between the familiar and fantastical. The word itself carries a certain weight. Sinus Folas, from the breed dog and Kefelhead, dog-headed man. In the quiet scriptums and royal courts of medieval Europe, this term was spoken with scholarly seriousness, written about in encyclopedias and depicted in lavishly illustrated manuscripts. These were not mere monsters but a race of beings, people with human bodies and the heads of dogs or jackals. They walked to pride, wore clothes, used weapons, and lived in societies. Some accounts claim they barked their communications, others insisted they spoke recognizable languages, jaws that spoke Latin, fur that feared God. As one poetic monk described them in a marginal note that has survived the centuries, the earliest Western mentions of these dog-headed people trace back to ancient Greek writings. The physician Cassius in the 5th century wrote of Sinus Folas living in the mountains of India. The great historian Herodotus mentioned them as dwelling in Libya. These classical references gave the concept scholarly legitimacy that carried forward into medieval thought. But the medieval fascination with Sinus Folas bloomed into something far richer than simple repetition of ancient accounts. Their existence became entwined with Christian cosmology, with questions of what it meant to be human, with the theological puzzles of salvation and the soul. Imagine yourself as a medieval European, perhaps a merchant, a noble, or a cleric. Your world is largely confined to the village or town of your birth. Your understanding of distant lands comes not from photographs or videos, but from travelers' tales, rumor reports, and texts copied and recopied over centuries, often embellished or altered with each transcription. In this context, how would you classify reports of dog-headed people? Were they humans, deformed by strange climate or divine punishment? Were they animals blessed with unusual intelligence? Were they demons in physical form, or perhaps a lost tribe mentioned in some obscure biblical passage? The medieval mind, contrary to popular belief, did not simply accept all wonders uncritically. Many scholars approached such accounts with skepticism tempered by religious openness to divine mystery. The influential 7th century encyclopedist Isidore of Seville classified sinus folles as not men but beasts, that other authorities argued they possess reason and therefore must have human souls. These dog-headed beings were most commonly placed in the distant east in Ethiopia, India, or even further in the misty lands beyond. Geography and imagination blended in these accounts. The very remoteness of these locations allowed the stories to persist. Few would ever journey to these far regions to confirm or deny such reports, and those who did travel often returned with tales of wonders that, rather than dispelling myths, simply added new layers to them. What's fascinating is how detailed these accounts sometimes became. The 14th century book of John Mandeville described sinus folles as skilled traders who raised livestock and cultivated crops. They were said to understand reason, worship idols, and have a king who wore a ruby the size of a goose egg. Such specific details lent credibility to the accounts, anchoring the fantastic in the mundane rhythms of agriculture and commerce. As Christianity spread across Europe, theologians wrestled with questions about these beings. If sinus folles existed, did they descend from Adam and Eve? Could they receive salvation? Should missionaries attempt to convert them to Christianity? These weren't idle questions but serious theological concerns about the boundaries of humanity and the reach of divine grace. The sinus folles thus existed in a liminal space not quite human, not merely animal, that reflected medieval anxieties about the edges of the known world and the nature of humanity itself. They embodied both fear of the foreign and fascination with the mysterious. They were simultaneously evidence of God's boundless creativity and a challenge to simple categorizations of His creation. As you drift deeper into sleep, consider how comforting definitive categories can be and how challenging it is when beings exist in the spaces between our neat classifications. The dog-headed man stood at that threshold, howling not just from the pages of bestiaries but from the borderlands of medieval imagination, where wonder and worry, curiosity and caution blended into a twilight realm of possibility in the quiet solitude of medieval monasteries. Far from the bustle of towns and villages, monks bent over writing desks crafting some of history's most beautiful books. Here, in these sacred spaces designed for contemplation and divine connection, the sinus folles found perhaps their most detailed and enduring documentation. Imagine Brother Thomas, a fictional but representative monk of the 12th century. He rises before dawn for matins, the first prayer of the day, and after several hours of devotion breaks his fast with simple bread and ale. Then he makes his way to the scriptorium, the writing room where manuscripts are copied and created. Today, he's working on a bestiary book cataloging God's creatures, both common and extraordinary. Brother Thomas has never left his native England. He has never seen a lion, an elephant, or even the Mediterranean Sea. Yet today, with careful strokes of his quill pen, he is illustrating dog-headed men set to life in distant Ethiopia. The red and gold pigments are precious, reserved for important elements of the manuscript. He applies them carefully to the Cynosphala's royal garments, marking these creatures as significant, worthy of the monastery's limited resources. What is in Brother Thomas' mind as he works? Not fantasy or fiction as we might assume, but a complex blend of faith, scholarly tradition, and cosmological understanding. He has read the accounts of St. Augustine, pondering whether such beings, if they exist, have rational souls. He knows that respected authorities like Pliny the Elder and Isidore of Seville have classified these creatures. In his worldview, Cynosephalos are as real as the unseen Jerusalem he prays toward, not personally witnessed, but attested to by trustworthy sources. The emotional mindset of the medieval monk and illuminator was unique. There was caution, certainly a reverence for tradition and authority that made innovation suspect, yet there was also remarkable imaginative freedom within that framework. When Brother Thomas depicts a dog-headed man holding a shield or tending sheep, he is not being whimsical but attempting to understand and categorize God's creation and all its bewildering variety. The bestiaries where Cynosephalos most often appear were not simply zoological texts. They were moral and spiritual guidebooks, where each creature represented virtues, vices, or theological truths. The lion symbolized resurrection because medieval people believed lion cubs were born dead and brought to life by their father's breath. The pelican represented Christ's sacrifice, as it was thought to wound itself to feed its young with its own blood. In this symbolic context, what did the dog-headed men represent? Often, they embodied the tension between reason and bestial nature, creatures with human intelligence but animal form. Sometimes they symbolized distant peoples who had not yet received the gospel. In their ambiguous status, they raised profound questions about what defined humanity. Was it physical form, rational thought, moral capacity, or divine endowment? The medieval geographical understanding or lack thereof created fertile ground for such creatures to flourish in imagination. Maps of the period often featured detailed illustrations of European towns and landmarks. But as the mapmaker's knowledge reached its limits, the parchment didn't simply go blank. Instead, those unknown regions were filled with illustrations. Here be dragons, here be Cynosephalos, here be antipods, men with feet turned backward. This reflected a worldview that couldn't tolerate emptiness or acknowledge ignorance. The unknown wasn't simply unknown, it was populated with marvels. As one medieval scholar wrote in a manuscript margin and in those quiet scriptoriums, truth was sometimes just what felt like it could be true. The statement captures the medieval approach to knowledge, not experimental or empirical as we understand it today, but based on authority, analogy, and allegorical significance, without widespread travel or scientific method to verify claims. How could anyone definitively state that dog-headed men didn't exist in unexplored Ethiopia or India? Geography, coupled with the limited means of exploration, allowed legends to bloom unchallenged, with occasional travelers return with tales of strange peoples and customs. These often became distorted through repetition and translation, sometimes reinforcing rather than debunking existing myths. As your consciousness drifts between wakefulness and sleep, consider how we still populate our own unknown spaces with projections of wonder and worry. The medieval monks' dog-headed men might find modern parallels in our speculations about alien civilizations or the depths of our oceans. Perhaps the human mind has always needed to fill the blank spaces on its maps, whether with Cynosephalos or with other manifestations of our deepest questions about where humanity ends and otherness begins. Imagine, if you will, a world where the boundaries between monstrous and sacred blur, where the grotesque can become glorious, and where the divine emerges from the most unexpected of beings, such as the astonishing tale of Saint Christopher, the enigmatic dog-headed saint whose story defies the ordinary and illuminates the extraordinary spiritual imagination of the medieval mind. Christopher's story begins not in sanctity, but in stark monstrosity, originally known as reprobus, meaning the reprobate, the rejected one, who was described in early medieval accounts as a fearsome giant warrior, born among the Sinus Falles, those mythical dog-headed beings inhabiting distant lands often imagined as barbaric and cannibalistic. Towering in stature, with terrifying strength and the fierce visage of a canine beast, Reprobus was a warrior serving the king of his savage homeland. Yet beneath this fearsome exterior, a deep longing stirred a quest to serve not just any king but the greatest king in all the world. His odyssey began when Reprobus set forth from his violent homeland, journeying through lands and kingdoms, pledging allegiance first to powerful earthly rulers, only to find each one revealed as flawed or fearful. Each disappointment propelled him onward, until finally his path crossed that of a humble hermit who spoke of a king unlike any other, a king who ruled not through force but through sacrifice and compassion. Intrigued, the monstrous warrior sought out this mysterious Christ, sensing deep within his fierce heart the truth he had long sought. Upon his eventual encounter with Christianity, Reprobus experienced a profound transformation. Legend speaks movingly of the moment he received baptism, a miracle unfolding as his fierce bark softened, replaced suddenly by clear human speech, reborn spiritually. He chose a new name, Christopher, meaning Christ-bearer. It was more than symbolic. Soon, tales arose of him literally carrying the Christ child across a dangerous, turbulent river, his formidable strength used not to conquer but to protect and serve. Picture then the vivid scenes that adorn the walls of medieval churches from Byzantium to Egypt, icons of Saint Christopher, and Eastern Orthodox and Coptic traditions portray him in startling detail, a mighty figure clad in warrior's garb, shoulders broad and powerful, yet crowned unmistakably by the furred snarling head of a dog or jackal. These sacred artworks captured a paradoxical majesty, monstrous yet divine, terrifying yet tender. They served as potent symbols, proclaiming a powerful message: the grace of God knows no boundary, redemption is possible even for the most fearsome and misunderstood. Consider the impact on medieval worshippers who gazed upon these remarkable images. What deeper truths did they sense as they beheld this dog-headed saint? Perhaps they saw reassurance that divine love extended beyond human conceptions of beauty or acceptability. Perhaps for those who felt themselves outsiders or feared monsters within, Christopher offered profound hope. Even the most fearsome aspects of ourselves could be transformed and sanctified. Moreover, Christopher held special resonance in regions like Egypt and Ethiopia, where ancient cultures had long revered deities with animalistic features, such as the jackal-headed Anubis. For converts in these regions, Christopher represented a bridge between their ancestral beliefs and their newfound Christian faith, a reassurance that embracing Christ need not mean erasing their cultural past but rather transforming it through faith and devotion. As devotion to Christopher spread westward into Europe, however, artists gradually softened his canine features, perhaps out of discomfort or simply unfamiliarity with the Eastern tradition. By the late medieval period, Christopher emerged as a fully human figure. Though still depicted as towering and mighty, the original, remarkable dog-headed depictions lingered primarily in isolated Eastern monasteries and obscure texts, enduring testimonies to a richly imaginative and spiritually expansive medieval worldview. This gradual shift in imagery was not merely artistic, it was deeply philosophical. Medieval theologians actively debated the nature of sanctity itself. What truly makes one holy, they asked, a pleasing face or a faithful heart? Saint Christopher's existence as a dog-headed saint boldly challenged prevailing assumptions, suggesting a profound answer. Holiness is measured not by physical appearance but by spiritual devotion, courage, and compassion. One theologian beautifully captured the sentiment in the 13th century, stating, "The blessed Christopher proves that Christ looks not upon the countenance but upon the heart, and that heaven may be attained not by those who appear most human in form, but those most human in spirit." This idea challenged the medieval tendency to equate outward difference with moral failing, advocating instead a more inclusive understanding of humanity and salvation. As you allow sleep to gently claim you, consider the profound symbolism embodied in Saint Christopher's journey from monstrous outsider to revered saint. His story is our story, a reminder that even in our deepest fears and uncertainties, the divine awaits, offering the possibility of redemption, transformation, and profound understanding. In this liminal space between waking and dreaming, perhaps the boundaries between monster and saint fade away, revealing a profound truth that true humanity is defined not by how we appear, but by whom we choose to carry in our hearts. In the quiet lantern-lit libraries and vibrant marketplaces of medieval Islamic cities, a parallel but strikingly different tradition of documenting dog-headed men emerged. While European monks adorned their manuscripts with strange illustrations of these enigmatic beings, scholars in the Islamic Golden Age approached the Sinus Follis with a blend of meticulous observation, scholarly skepticism, and boundless curiosity, weaving tales that illuminate the rich tapestry of medieval understanding. One of the earliest encounters was described by Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab emissary who traveled from north to the Volga Bulgars. His detailed accounts reveal a world full of astonishing wonders and perplexing encounters. Ibn Fadlan wrote of beings whose descriptions closely resembled the Sinus Follis. Though he expressed uncertainty about their true nature, reflecting a cautious approach to the unknown, his accounts were vivid yet cautious, designed to report faithfully what he observed without exaggeration. Meanwhile, Ibn Sina, known to Europeans as Avicenna, dove deeper into the matter from a scientific and philosophical perspective. In his monumental medical encyclopedia, he pondered whether dog-headed beings could have arisen through natural causes rather than supernatural intervention. Ibn Sina's rational approach sought explanations rooted in observation and logic, marking a significant departure from purely mythical interpretations prevalent elsewhere. Perhaps the most comprehensive and intriguing documentation comes from Ibn Battuta, the legendary 14th century Moroccan traveler whose journey spanned over 75 miles, more than any other medieval figure. His vast travels took him through diverse landscapes, from the deserts of North Africa to the bustling markets of India and the distant islands of Southeast Asia. During these adventures, he heard vivid tales of dog-headed inhabitants in the remote islands of the East Indies. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Ibn Battuta maintained a prudent skepticism. His notes reflect the balance of wonder and doubt. "I have seen many wonders in my travels, that this particular marvel remained beyond my own eyes, though reliable men swore to its truth." Another crucial figure was al-Idrisi, the 12th century Arab geographer commissioned by the Norman king Roger of Sicily to produce one of the most sophisticated world maps of the era. Al-Idrisi meticulously located the habitats of dog-headed men in the islands east of the known world, describing them vividly. Their heads resemble those of dogs, Yet their bodies are human, they bark rather than speak, their nails are sharp, and they scratch the ground for sustenance. Al-Idrisi's description was precise, almost clinical, highlighting his commitment to accuracy rather than sensationalism. Yet even among these rational accounts, the fantastical was never entirely absent. Al-Qaswini, the esteemed 13th century Persian cosmographer, catalogued the Sinus Phalas alongside other astonishing marvels, men whose faces appeared on their chests, others with giant ears so vast they used them as blankets. In his influential work, Wonders of Creation, Al-Qaswini illuminated how the unfamiliar was both fascinating and fearsome, exotic yet somehow conceivable. These narratives vividly portrayed the boundaries of human knowledge, marking the space where empirical observation blended seamlessly with imaginative storytelling. What's remarkable about these Islamic perspectives is their intellectual and emotional detachment compared to European anxieties. While Christian theologians grappled with profound spiritual questions about the Sinus Phalas, souls, and salvation, Muslim scholars typically adopted a scholarly stance focused on empirical observation and classification. They viewed dog-headed beings primarily as natural phenomena to be documented, classified, and rationalized, rather than spiritual mysteries demanding theological scrutiny. This difference in perspective was rooted deeply in the rich scholarly traditions of the Islamic world. Known for their extensive networks of trade and intellectual exchange, Arab and Persian scholars, merchants, and travelers routinely crossed continents, bringing first-hand information about distant peoples and lands. Yet, even with these extensive connections, the inclusion of dog-headed beings in serious geographic and scientific works demonstrates how even the most knowledgeable societies grapple with defining the boundaries of the known world. These beings served as a critical cultural and intellectual marker, a representation of the distant, the mysterious, and ultimately, the unknowable. As an Arab philosopher insightfully noted in the margins of a scholarly treatise, at times our depictions of the unknown serve less to explain it and more to keep it distant, safely beyond our familiar world. Comparing Eastern and Western interpretations reveals profound cultural insights. European images of Sinus Phalas were often monstrous and threatening, laden with moral and spiritual implications, reflecting deep anxieties about otherness and humanity. In contrast, Islamic accounts frequently viewed these beings with scientific curiosity and less pronounced moral judgment, classifying them as strange yet still essentially part of the natural world's diversity. These different attitudes illustrate vividly how myths and legends embody their originating cultures. Through Arab eyes, the dog-headed beings were primarily curiosity's objects of inquiry rather than symbols of moral uncertainty. Nevertheless, across both cultural traditions, the Sinus Phalas served as potent symbols representing the boundary between known humanity and unknowable mystery. As sleep gently embraces you, reflect on how these different medieval perceptions of the same beings reveal the subtle yet profound ways cultures interpret the unfamiliar, whether through the rational inquiries of Ibn Sina, the cautious skepticism of Ibn Battuta, or the meticulous documentation by Al-Idrisi. These accounts offer valuable insights into human curiosity, imagination, and our eternal quest to define and yet remain enchanted by the boundaries of our understanding. The sound of hoofbeats on dusty roads, the clink of mail and the creak of leather, banner-bearing armies moving across unfamiliar landscapes toward Jerusalem and other cities of the East. The Crusades, beginning in the late 11th century, brought tens of thousands of Europeans into direct contact with cultures and regions previously known to them only through texts and rumors. In this collision of worlds, the myth of the Cynoscephalus found new life and new purpose. Imagine a knight from rural Normandy or Bavaria, likely illiterate but steeped in oral traditions about the marvels of the East, as he marches through Byzantine territories. Across Anatolia and into the Levant, every unfamiliar custom, language, dress, and religious practice he encounters seems to confirm that he has entered a world where anything might be possible, even dog-headed men. The Crusades created a perfect storm for legend building. Soldiers faced the physical and psychological strains of dangerous journeys through hostile territories. Heat, disease, unfamiliar foods, strange languages, and the constant threat of attack created conditions where misunderstanding and misinterpretation flourished. A distant group of warriors wearing unusual helmets or carrying animal-decorated shields might, in the telling and retelling of campfire stories, transform into the dog-headed men of legend. Adding to this confusion was the genuine cultural shock of encountering Eastern practices. Crusaders witnessed religious ceremonies unlike anything in their experience, observed different gender norms, encountered unfamiliar animals like camels and different breeds of dogs, and tried to communicate across profound language barriers. The cognitive dissonance created by these experiences demanded explanatory frameworks, and existing legends about strange beings in the East provided ready templates. When these knights returned to Europe, if they survived to return, they brought back not carefully documented anthropological observations but impressions filtered through fear, wonder, prejudice, and the natural human tendency to emphasize the exotic when telling tales of distant adventures. A crusader who had seen strange dog-headed helmets or masks in rituals might, in good faith, report having encountered territories near to the lands of the Cynoscephalus. One 13th century chronicle records a returning knight's testimony beyond the lands of the Saracens, where the sun burns hotter than any oven in France. We heard from trustworthy men of a race who speak through barking and fight with the ferocity of wild beasts, yet craft tools and build dwellings like Christians. These were said to be but 3 days' journey from where we made camp. Though our captain forbade any expedition to verify these claims, such second-hand accounts, impossible to verify yet difficult to entirely dismiss, kept the Cynoscephalus firmly in the medieval geographical imagination. They also served important emotional and psychological functions for both crusaders and those who heard their tales. For the knights themselves, these legends helped process the genuine culture shock of encountering the East. For those at home, tales of dog-headed men and other marvels reinforced the sense that crusaders have ventured into a realm fundamentally different from Europe, a realm that needed either Christian conversion or containment. There was a darker side to these legends as well. By associating eastern regions with semi-human monsters, crusader accounts sometimes helped dehumanize the very real people they encountered and fought. As one medieval historian has noted, a battlefield does not only shape scars, but stories. The Cynoscephalus became convenient emblems of otherness, reinforcing the crusading mission as not just a military campaign but a confrontation with forces at the edge of humanity. Yet the cultural exchange worked both ways. Some scholars believe that Western accounts of dog-headed men may have influenced Eastern tales of similar creatures. Certainly, the close contact between cultures facilitated by the Crusades created new hybrid legends and representations. In Crusader-controlled territories like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, artistic traditions blended, sometimes producing unique depictions of monstrous races that incorporated both Western and Eastern elements. As crusading fervor eventually waned, the dog-headed men remained in European consciousness, but their geographical location shifted. As the Near East became more familiar through ongoing trade and diplomatic relations, the Cynoscephalus were pushed further from the known world, relocated to Central Asia. Deepest Africa, or remote islands and uncharted seas, like a receding horizon, they maintained their role as markers of the limits of knowledge, always just beyond the edge of the verified world. As you drift deeper toward sleep, consider how these returning nights shaped European understanding not just of geography but of humanity itself. Their tales of dog-headed men weren't simply entertaining stories but attempts to make sense of profound encounters with difference. In their accounts, we can trace the complex emotional weight of meeting the unfamiliar, the simultaneous attraction and repulsion, fascination and fear that still characterizes human encounters with otherness today. In the soft glow of candlelight, an artist mixes pigments: precious lapis lazuli for blue, toxic cinnabar for red, gold leaf that will catch even the faintest light. With these materials, more valuable than many peasants would see in a lifetime, he will breathe life into the margins of a manuscript. Today, along the border of a religious text, he will paint a dog-headed man staring out at the reader with unsettlingly human eyes. Medieval art was never merely decorative. It was theological, didactic, symbolic, a visual language as complex as the written word that often accompanied it. When artists depicted Cynoscephalus in manuscripts, church carvings, and eventually in the new medium of printed books, they were engaging in visual philosophy, exploring profound questions about the nature of humanity, monstrosity, and divine creation. The locations where these dog-headed figures appeared are telling. They rarely occupied the center of illuminated pages. Instead, they lurked in margins and borders, inhabiting the literal edges of the medieval world picture, just as they were believed to inhabit the geographical margins of the known world. A Cynoscephalus might peer from behind a pillar in a scene of Christ's ministry, or crouch in a decorated initial letter beginning a psalm, or march alongside other monstrous races along the bottom of a page discussing God's creation. This placement was not accidental but allegorical. The margins represented the boundaries of order creation. The liminal spaces where the familiar gave way to the monstrous, yet even as Cynoscephalus were marginalized, they were still included within the sacred space of religious texts, suggesting that even these half-human creatures had their place in divine order. The artistic representations of dog-headed men varied widely across medieval Europe. In Germanic manuscripts, they often appeared as fierce warriors, heavily armed and threatening. In French bestiaries, they might be shown more domestically, wearing clothes and using tools. English sources frequently depicted them with exaggerated canine features, elongated snouts, prominent teeth, pointed ears, emphasizing their bestial nature. Byzantine art, maintaining the tradition of the dog-headed Saint Christopher, sometimes showed them in poses of devotion or bearing Christian symbols. These artistic choices reflected regional anxieties and preoccupations. Germanic territories, more frequently threatened by invasion, portrayed Cynoscephalus as embodiments of military threat from unknown peoples. French courtly culture, concerned with civilization and proper behavior, emphasized the almost human, yet not quite right social behaviors attributed to dog-headed races. Color choices carried symbolic weight as well. Cynoscephalus were often depicted with reddish-brown fur, associating them with foxes and wolves, animals linked in medieval symbolism with deception and predation. Yet some manuscript illustrations show them in royal blue or purple garments, colors associated with nobility and authority, creating a visual paradox that challenged viewers to reconsider their assumptions about monstrosity and power. What's remarkable about medieval artistic depictions of dog-headed men is their repetition and consistency. The same visual motifs appeared again and again across centuries and regions. This visual repetition created a powerful sense of reality. As one scholar notes, a child seeing a dog-headed knight in church stained glass, then finding the same figure in a manuscript, then hearing travelers' tales of such creatures, would believe. The cumulative weight of these representations made Sinus Fala seem like documented fact rather than speculation. The artistic tradition surrounding dog-headed men raises fascinating questions about the boundaries between storytelling and theology. Were artists who depicted Sinus Falas simply illustrating popular legends? Or were they engaging in visual theology, exploring through art the same questions that philosophers tackled in text? What defines humanity? How do we understand beings at the boundaries of our categories? How vast and varied would God's creation be? A particularly interesting example comes from a 13th century Bible, moralist Bible, that shows God creating Adam alongside a dog-headed man, suggesting that both were part of the original divine plan, rather than the Sinus Falas being some later aberration or consequence of the fall. This visual theology offered a more inclusive vision of creation than many written texts, suggesting that difference was divinely ordained rather than monstrous. As the medieval period progressed into the Renaissance, artistic depictions of Sinus Falas became more self-consciously symbolic rather than documentary. Periodism Bosch included dog-headed figures among his phantasmagoric creatures representing human sins and follies. By the 16th century, as European exploration disproved many medieval geographical assumptions, the dog-headed men retreated from serious cosmology into allegory and eventually fantasy. Yet their visual power persisted. Even as they were no longer believed to literally exist, they remain potent symbols of authority, the not quite human other against which humanity defined itself. In the symbolic afterlife, the artistic tradition of the Sinus Falas continued to pose the same essential questions about identity and difference that had fascinated medieval viewers. As your consciousness floats in that space between waking and sleeping, imagine those countless medieval eyes that gazed upon these images, the child at church looking up at stained glass Sinus Falas, the monk studying bestiary illustrations by candlelight, the noble viewing richly illuminated manuscripts in a castle cellar. Each encountered these dog-headed beings not as fantasy but as possibility, creatures that challenged the comfortable boundaries between human and animal, familiar and foreign, self and other. Beneath the colorful depictions and fantastic tales of dog-headed men lay deeper currents of meaning. The Sinus Falas were never just curious creatures in a medieval bestiary, they were powerful symbols in an ongoing conversation about human identity, difference, and the exercise of power. To understand them fully, we must excavate these deeper layers of significance. The medieval period was marked by profound anxieties about boundaries, geographical, religious, social, and biological. Europe defined itself against numerous others, Muslims to the south and east, pagans to the north, and imagined monstrous races beyond all known borders. In this context, the dog-headed men served a crucial psychological and political function. They helped define what it meant to be fully human by embodying partial or compromised humanity. Consider the specific animal chosen for these hybrid beings. Dogs in medieval culture occupied an ambiguous position, domestic yet wild, loyal yet potentially dangerous, familiar yet ultimately alien in their nature, unlike purely fantastical creatures like dragons or griffins. Dogs were everyday companions whose animal nature was constantly observed. This made the dog-headed men particularly unsettling. They combined the familiar with the foreign in ways that questioned the very categories people relied upon to make sense of their world. The placement of Sinus Valles on medieval maps reveals much about power relations. They were consistently located in regions beyond European control in Ethiopia, India, or uncharted islands. These were precisely the areas European powers sought to influence through trade, missionary activity, or military conquest. By populating these territories with semi-human monsters rather than fully human peoples with legitimate societies and claims to land, medieval European culture created an implicit justification for expansion and domination. A 14th century Dominican missionary wrote of territories rumored to contain dog-headed people. These lands cry out for the light of Christ's teaching, for beings who stand upon two legs yet lack true human countenance may still possess souls worthy of salvation. The statement reveals the complex entanglement of religious conversion and cultural imperialism. The Sinus Valles simultaneously justified missionary efforts and symbolized the supposed inferiority of non-European peoples. The dog-headed men also reflected internal European anxieties about difference. Medieval society was highly stratified, with rigid hierarchies of class, gender, and religious status. Physical difference, particularly facial difference caused by disease, injury, or congenital conditions, often led to marginalization. In this context, the Sinus Valles can be read as exaggerated representations of human variation, reflecting deep fears about what constituted acceptable difference within society. Some medieval commentators made this connection explicit. A 12th century theologian wrote, just as the Sinus Valles have the form of men but the heads of beasts, so do sinners walk among us with human bodies but bestial thoughts. Such statements reveal how monstrous races served as moral allegories, embodying spiritual rather than just physical alterity. The emotional and psychological dimensions of these beliefs were profound. Fear of the monstrous other helped solidify community identity. We were to fight against them, the strange dog-headed beings at the world's edge, yet there was also a shadowy recognition that the boundary between human and monster might be more permeable than comfortable to admit. As one scholar has observed, to call someone a beast is sometimes easier than admitting you don't understand them. This insight reveals the power dynamics inherent in categorizing others as monstrous, the ability to label another group as less than human, or in this case, as human-animal hybrids, was an assertion of definitional authority. European Christians claimed the power to determine who was fully human, who was monstrous, and who occupied the unsettling territory between these categories. Yet medieval thinking about Sinus Valles was never monolithic. Some writers used these beings to argue for a more inclusive understanding of humanity. The influential 13th century philosopher Albertus Magnus suggested that dog-headed men, despite their appearance, might possess reason and therefore should be considered human in the most essential sense. Such arguments challenged simplistic divisions between human and monster, suggesting that reason and moral capacity, not physical appearance, define true humanity. The debate about Sinus Valles became particularly pointed when Europeans began to encounter unfamiliar peoples through increased trade and early exploration. Were strange customs, languages, and practices evidence that these were different kinds of beings, or simply different expressions of a shared humanity? The dog-headed man, long established in the European imagination, provided a conceptual framework that sometimes led to profound misunderstandings of actual human diversity. When Marco Polo described the inhabitants of the Andaman Islands as having heads like dogs in the 13th century, was he seeing actual physical difference? misinterpreting cultural practices such as ritual masks or headdresses, or simply fitting his observations into pre-existing categories of the monstrous. The ambiguity reveals how powerful the sinus-volus archetype had become in structuring European perceptions of difference. As you drift toward deeper sleep, consider how these medieval anxieties about difference and humanity continue to resonate. We may no longer believe in dog-headed men, but the question of who belongs fully within the circle of humanity, who deserves recognition, rights, and respect, remains as urgent now as it was when medieval artists inked sinus volus into the margins of their world. The struggle to recognize the humanity in those who appear different, who speak differently, who live differently, continues across centuries. The ancient challenge of seeing past the dog's head to the human heart within unfold a medieval map, not the simplified diagrams we might imagine, but a lavish creation like the 13th century Hereford Mappamundi or the intricate nautical charts known as portolans. What you would immediately notice is how different these maps are from our modern cartographic conventions. They are not simply geographic records but cosmological statements, spiritual documents, and venues for storytelling. The world depicted on medieval maps was emphatically bounded, typically circular, with Jerusalem at the center, Paradise in the east usually at the top of the map, and the known regions of Europe, Africa, and Asia ranged around the sacred geography. But what captures our imagination today are the edges of these maps, their richly illustrated borders where geographical knowledge gave way to speculation and wonder. Here, in these margins, the dog-headed men made their home alongside Blemmy's men with faces in their chests, Sapots people with a single giant foot, and other monstrous races inherited from classical tradition. On the Hereford map, sinus volus appear in Ethiopia, shown as humanoid figures with dogs' heads, sometimes wielding clubs or spears. On other maps, they occupy islands in the far Indian Ocean, territories so distant that blur the line between geographical reality and cosmological symbolism. Why were these beings so consistently placed at the world's edge? The answer reveals much about medieval cosmology and psychology. The known world was understood as orderly, hierarchical, and divinely sanctioned. Moving outward from the center meant not just increasing geographical distance but increasing spiritual and natural disorder. The edges represented spaces where God's ordered creation began to fray and distort, where human might blend with animal, where normal rules might be suspended. This spatial arrangement reflected a profound emotional and philosophical truth: humans place mystery at the edges of what we know. The dog-headed men were embodiments of this mystery, not fully animal, not fully human, impossible to categorize neatly within the great chain of being that structured medieval understanding of creation. Their marginal habitat on maps mirrored their marginal status in theology and natural philosophy. For the medieval mind, these edges were not simply blank spaces awaiting exploration. They were necessary components of a complete world picture, regions that balanced the known with the unknown, the familiar with the strange. As one 14th century mapmaker noted in Latin, along the southern edge of his creation, beyond this place there may be fearsome monsters, but also wonders that glorify God's creation. The emotional resonance of these marginal spaces was complex. They inspired fear. Certainly the edges were dangerous, populated by beings who might be hostile to normal humans, but they also inspired wonder and a species of comfort. The map monsters suggested that even the most bizarre and threatening aspects of creation had their proper place in divine order. Nothing existed outside God's plan. Even dog-headed men belonged somewhere. There's a profound metaphorical significance to this cartographic tradition that speaks across centuries. We all maintain mental maps of reality. with familiar territory at the center and various unknowns relegated to the margins. The psychological comfort of having everything in its place, even if that place is at the periphery, remains a powerful human need. The medieval mapmakers who carefully illustrated sinus follows at the world's edge were engaging in what we might now recognize as collective cognitive management, using these strange beings to acknowledge mystery while keeping it safely contained, as European exploration gradually pushed back the geographical boundaries of the unknown. The dog-headed men were forced to retreat from map to map, always staying just beyond the edge of the verified world. When one region was explored and found to contain ordinary humans rather than Sanisfolas, cartographers simply relocated these beings to the next unknown territory. They were too valuable as boundary markers to abandon entirely, even as their specific geography shifted. By the late 15th century, as Portuguese sailors pushed down the African coast and Columbus sailed west, the traditional locations for sinus follows were increasingly untenable. Yet they didn't immediately disappear from maps and geographical thinking. Instead, they migrated to more distant, less accessible locations, remote mountain ranges, impenetrable forests, islands far from shipping lanes. Their durability speaks to the psychological necessity of maintaining spaces for wonder and possibility. Even as empirical knowledge expanded, this cartographic history raises a question that resonates beyond medieval maps. Where are our own mental margins today? In an age of satellite imagery and global exploration, have we lost the psychological space for dog-headed men and other embodiments of the wonderfully strange? Or have we simply relocated our monsters and marvels to new frontiers, deep ocean trenches, distant planets, or the uncharted territories of quantum reality? As you rest in the borderland between wakefulness and sleep itself, a kind of margin where normal rules of thought and perception begin to blur, consider the edges of your own mental map. What dog-headed men might dwell there? What wonders and mysteries do you place just beyond the boundaries of your certain knowledge? Perhaps the medieval cartographers understood something profound about human cognition, that we need these marginal spaces and their strange inhabitants. Not despite our quest for understanding, but because of it. As the night deepens around you, imagine a medieval sleeper, a farmer in his humble cottage, a merchant in her tall house, a monk in his bar cell. Like you, they lie in darkness listening to the sounds of the night. Unlike you, they have no electric lights to banish the shadows, no scientific explanations for strange noises, no global communications to verify what might be real in distant lands. As they drift towards sleep, what populates their mental landscape? What stories and beings flow through their consciousness? For many medieval people, the dog-headed men were not just scholarly curiosities or artistic motifs, but living presences in memory and imagination. Tales of sinus follows were part of an oral tradition that permeated medieval culture, stories told by firelight, repeated by travelers, embellished by each new teller. These narratives provided more than entertainment, they offered cognitive frameworks for understanding a world that often seemed chaotic, threatening, and bewilderingly large. Memory and medieval culture worked differently than in our text-based, image-saturated present. In a society where most people could not read, memory was cultivated as a powerful tool, trained through repetition, association, and vivid imagery. The strange hybrid form of the dog-headed man, part familiar, part foreign, made it particularly memorable. Easy to recall and describe, when a traveler spoke of distant lands where such beings might dwell, listeners could immediately conjure the image in their minds. This memorability served important cultural functions. The sinus follows and other monstrous races acted as mnemonic devices for geographical knowledge, mental markers that helped organize understanding of the world's vastness. Beyond the land of the Ethiopians, where the dog-headed men dwell, was not just colorful language but a practical way to conceptualize global geography in the absence of accurate maps and universal education. For children in medieval communities, stories of dog-headed men provided both warning and wonder. Parents might caution, don't wander too far into the forest, that's where strange beings dwell. Yet these same tales sparked imagination and curiosity about the wider world. The Sinus Falas embodied both the dangers and possibilities that existed beyond the known, beyond the village boundaries, beyond the safe and familiar. The emotional comfort these myths provided shouldn't be underestimated. Medieval life was precarious. Disease, war, famine, and natural disaster were constant threats, often striking without warning or apparent cause. In such an environment, having a coherent worldview, even one that included dog-headed men at its edges, provided crucial psychological stability. If everything, even the monstrous and strange, had its proper place in divine creation, then perhaps the hardships of life also had meaning and purpose. Night brought special significance to these beliefs. In the medieval world, darkness was absolute in a way modern people rarely experience. Without artificial lighting, night transformed familiar landscapes into territories of shadow and uncertainty. The boundaries between the known and unknown, the natural and supernatural, seemed more permeable after sunset. The dog-headed man and other marvels that might be dismissed in daylight grew more plausible in the darkness. A 13th century sermon describes how in the night hours, when God tests our faith by withdrawing the light, the mind may wander to the world's edges, where creatures neither fully man nor fully beast may roam. This reflects the understanding that night was not just a physical condition but a spiritual state, a time when ordinary certainties might be questioned and extraordinary possibilities entertained. Sleep itself was understood differently in medieval thought. While we typically view sleep as a biological necessity separate from spiritual or intellectual life, medieval people often saw it as a liminal state where the soul might gain insights unavailable during waking hours. Dreams could be divine messages, temptations from demons, or glimpses of distant realities, including perhaps the territories where Sinus Falas dwelled. Medical texts from the period suggest that contemplating marvels like dog-headed men before sleep could influence one's dreams and spiritual state. A 14th century physician advised before retiring to bed, the mind should dwell on God's wonders, both the familiar beasts of our lands and the marvelous creatures of distant regions, for such contemplation prepares the soul for divine visitation during sleep. The Sinus Falas served not just as geographical markers but as spiritual waypoints, bridging the known and the mysterious. In isolated villages and remote castles in the deep forests and windswept moors of medieval Europe, the night brought both fear and a strange comfort. As one folk saying recorded by a 15th century monk expressed, perhaps they didn't believe, but perhaps they needed to pretend. This captures a profound truth about the dog-headed men and similar legends. Whether literally believed or not, they fulfill crucial psychological and social functions. As you rest in your own night, so different from the absolute darkness of the medieval world, yet still a time of vulnerability and reflection, consider how the myths that comfort us have changed in form but perhaps not in function. The Sinus Falas have retreated from our cosmology. Yet we still populate our mental margins with beings that help us process our fears and hopes, that give shape to the unknown, that make the vastness of existence comprehensible on human scale. As we approach the deeper waters of sleep, let's consider a possibility that might seem counterintuitive. Perhaps the dog-headed men were never meant to be understood as literally real, at least not by everyone. Perhaps for some medieval thinkers, they served a different purpose altogether as emotional and philosophical placeholders, as necessary components in a complete understanding of creation, as symbols more profound than any physical reality could be. This isn't to suggest that medieval people were engaged in conscious fiction making. Many undoubtedly believed in the literal existence of Sinus Fallis, just as they believed in distant Jerusalem without having seen it. But alongside this literal belief ran currents of more sophisticated symbolic thinking, particularly among educated clergy and philosophers. Consider the words of Isidore of Seville, whose 7th century encyclopedia Etymologicae was perhaps the most influential reference work of the entire medieval period. After cataloging various monstrous races, including the dog-headed men, he writes, but whether God desired to create certain races of monsters as he did normal human beings, or whether they traced their origin to Adam or to Noah's sons, what these monstrous races signify, only he knows, whose knowledge alone cannot be deceived. This passage reveals a nuanced approach. Isidore acknowledges uncertainty about the literal existence of these beings while affirming their significance. The key phrase is what these monstrous races signify, suggesting that their symbolic meaning might be more important than their physical reality. For medieval philosophers influenced by Neoplatonians, the material world was always just a shadow of higher reality anyway. The true nature of something lay in its divine idea, its place in the great chain of being, rather than in its physical manifestation. In this conceptual framework, dog-headed men could be real in a philosophical sense even if no physical examples were ever encountered. A 12th century theologian expressed this approach directly. Whether or not the dog-headed race walks upon the earth in distant lands, they exist in the divine mind as possibilities within creation, and thus have reality beyond mere fancy. This sophisticated understanding allowed educated medieval thinkers to include Sinus Fallis in their worldview while maintaining intellectual flexibility about their literal existence. What emotional needs did these beings fulfill, if not simply representing geographic facts? The evidence suggests they served as repositories for complex feelings about human nature, civilization, and morality. The dog-headed men embodied the tension between human rationality and animal instinct, a tension every medieval person, and indeed every human being, experiences internally. When manuscripts depicted Sinus Fallis engaged in recognizably human activities, building houses, wearing clothes, using tools, while retaining their bestial heads, they visualized the medieval understanding of human nature as perpetually divided between rational soul and animal body. Augustine of Hippo, whose writings profoundly shaped medieval thought, described humans as rational animals, beings caught between their spiritual potential and their physical nature. The dog-headed men externalized this internal division. Medieval culture was deeply concerned with boundaries between human and animal, civilization and wilderness, Christian and pagan, order and chaos. Yet everyday experience continually demonstrated how permeable these boundaries could be. Humans acted bestially during war or famine. Animals sometimes displayed seemingly rational behavior. Distant peoples had customs that seemed both recognizably human and profoundly foreign. The Sinus Fallis embodied this ambiguity, giving form to the uneasy recognition that categories could blur and boundaries could fail. There's evidence that some medieval people approached the dog-headed men with what we might recognize as a form of sophisticated skepticism. Roger Bacon, the 13th century philosopher and early proponent of empirical science, wrote, "Many wonders are told of monstrous men, but when travelers reach these lands, often what they find are men with customs strange to us, wearing animal skins or masks for rituals. which from a distance or through fear might be mistaken for monstrous features. This suggests an awareness that legends of Cynosfolus might be based on misunderstood human differences rather than actual human-animal hybrids. Yet even those who doubted the literal existence of dog-headed men often found value in them as conceptual tools. They provided ways to think about fundamental questions: what defines humanity? How do we understand beings or peoples who seem partially but not fully like ourselves? Where are the boundaries of community and moral consideration? These questions transcended the factual status of the Cynosfolus themselves. A particularly revealing comment comes from a 14th century philosopher who wrote, "Are there things we need to believe in, even if we don't believe them?" The paradoxical question captures something profound about the dog-headed men and similar wonders that serve functions beyond literal belief, helping to complete a worldview that would feel unscientifically empty without them. Without Cynosfolus and other monstrous races, the medieval map would have had blank spaces, their cosmology would have had gaps, their understanding of humanity would have lacked its defining contrasts. The dog-headed men filled necessary conceptual niches, regardless of whether one expected to ever encounter them physically. As you hover in that liminal space between wakefulness and dreams, consider your own necessary myths to concepts, beings, or possibilities that complete your picture of reality, that give shape to your hopes or fears, that help you navigate the boundaries of your understanding. Like the medieval person contemplating dog-headed men, perhaps you too maintain ideas whose literal truth matters less than the emotional truths they embody. As our journey through the medieval world of dog-headed men approaches its conclusion, let's gather the threads of this exploration and weave them into a tapestry of meaning. What can these strange beings from centuries past tell us about ourselves, about human imagination, about how we make sense of our world? The Cynosfolus were never simply errors in a primitive understanding of geography. They were elements in a complex system of meaning-making, serving purposes far beyond mere description. Their persistence across 1,000 years of European thought from ancient Greece through the Renaissance suggests they fulfilled essential cultural functions. Legends at their core do not exist primarily to record facts but to relate experiences, to connect human beings across time and space through shared emotional and intellectual frameworks. The dog-headed men connected medieval Europeans to their classical predecessors, to contemporary cultures in distant lands, and to a sense of divine order that encompassed even the strangest possibilities within creation. Every age has its monsters, and every age has myths to soothe the fears those monsters represent. Medieval Europeans feared the unknown territories beyond their experience, feared the potential loss of their humanity through sin or savagery, feared peoples whose languages and customs seemed alien and threatening. The Cynosfolus embodied these fears, giving them form and placing them within a manageable framework of understanding. But the dog-headed men were not just repositories for anxiety. They also represented fascination, wonder, and the tantalizing possibility that creation might be vastly more diverse and marvelous than everyday experience suggested. They populated a world that might otherwise have seemed too small, too known, too limited in its possibilities. They gave medieval imagination room to breathe. There's a profound humanity in this myth-making. Despite the technological and intellectual distances that separate us from our medieval ancestors, we recognize in their dog-headed men the same impulses that drive our modern mythologies: the desire to understand, to categorize, to find meaning in difference, to expand our sense of what might be possible. When we tell stories today about extraterrestrial life, artificial intelligence achieving consciousness, or undiscovered species in Earth's most remote regions, were engaging in the same fundamental human activity as the medieval mapmaker, placing Sinus Follis at the world's edge. We're populating our conceptual margins, giving form to our hopes and fears about what lies beyond our current understanding. The journey from fear to faith to fable that the dog-headed man traveled reflects a pattern we see across human cultures and throughout history. The terrifying unknown gradually becomes the exotic but comprehensible other, which eventually transforms into the symbolic repository of meaning. What begins as a threat to our sense of order becomes, with time and familiarity, a necessary component of that order. This pattern offers a certain comfort. Our own monsters, whether literal or metaphorical, may seem overwhelming in the moment, but human imagination has remarkable powers of integration. What seems to challenge our worldview today may in time come to support and enrich it. Just as the once fearsome Sinus Follis eventually found their place in medieval cosmology as evidence of divine creativity and purpose, there's a gentle wisdom in recognizing how the dog-headed men served as bridges between human and animal, known and unknown, self and other. They suggest that hard boundaries may be less important than the connections that span them, that categories matter less than the relationships between them. In a world increasingly defined by polarization and division, this medieval perspective offers a subtler approach to difference. Perhaps most movingly, the story of the dog-headed man reminds us that humanity has always defined itself through contrast with the other, yet paradoxically has always recognized something of itself in that other. The Sinus Follis were simultaneously not as and somehow also as reflections of human possibilities, human limitations, human complexity. Their dog heads marked them as different, but their human bodies and behavior suggested fundamental kinship. This dual nature speaks to our ongoing struggle to determine where the boundaries of our moral community should lie, who deserves our empathy, our protection, our recognition. The medieval debates about whether dog-headed men had souls that could be saved parallel our modern questions about the moral status of other beings, other intelligences, other ways of existing in the world. As you drift now toward deeper sleep, consider that some part of the medieval perspective lives on in each of us. When we look up at the stars and wonder, when we imagine what might exist beyond our experience, when we try to make sense of difference and distance in these moments, we're not so unlike those long-ago people who populated their mental margins with dog-headed men and found in them both meaning and mystery. And maybe some part of us still listens for pause in the night, still wonders what strange beings might inhabit the edges of our understanding, still needs these figures that stand at the threshold between the known and the unknown, reminding us that the world is always larger, stranger, and more wonderful than our everyday experience suggests. The candlelit scriptorium has grown quiet now. The monk has set aside his quill, closed his pots of precious pigments. The manuscript page where the dog-headed figure stands at the margin has been dusted with sand to dry the ink, the excess gently tapped away. Soon this image will join countless others bound between wooden covers, perhaps to be studied for centuries by eyes we'll never know. As we've wandered through medieval imagination together, perhaps you've noticed your own thoughts beginning to take on that dreamlike quality that precedes sleep. The boundaries between now and then, between our world and theirs, between waking thought and dreaming vision, have grown soft and permeable, not unlike the boundaries in medieval maps where known territories gradually gave way to lands of wonder and mystery. There's a certain rightness to ending our exploration of dog-headed men here in this drowsy borderland. After all, they too dwelled in between spaces between human and animal, between fact and fantasy. Between the center and the edge, they remind us that some of our most profound insights come not from rigid categories but from the blurred spaces where possibilities multiply. Let the medieval world recede now if you wish. Allow the dog-headed men to return to their distant shores, their remote islands, their places at the edge of ancient maps. They've served their purpose for tonight, carrying you away from the concerns of your day. Populating your imagination with something ancient and strange yet somehow familiar. The weight of your body might feel heavier now against the surface that supports you. Your breathing has perhaps found a slower, deeper rhythm. The thoughts that seemed so urgent hours ago have likely softened, lost their sharp edges, begun to blend with older memories and half-formed dreams. This is how knowledge worked for medieval people too, not always in the sharp clarity of full wakefulness, but often in these twilight states where the mind makes unexpected connections, where distant times and places can seem suddenly close, where the impossible doesn't need to justify itself with evidence or argument. And now, perhaps you can let the medieval world drift into the quiet, like a ship sailing over the horizon. The dog-headed men have played their part in your story tonight, just as they played their part in the stories our ancestors told themselves about the world and their place within it. They remind us that every map has its margins, every age has its mysteries, every human heart contains territories charted and uncharted. They suggest that what we don't know, what we can't know, isn't a failure of understanding, but a necessary space for wonder. As sleep perhaps begins to claim you, remember that you carry within you the same capacity for imagination that allowed medieval minds to populate their world with marvels. That creativity hasn't diminished across the centuries, it has simply found new forms, new expressions, new margins to fill with wonder. But that is a story for another quiet hour.